In the previous lesson, we have said to determine the inverse of a function, we switch the x and the y values. So, now let's talk about the domain and the range of the inverse function. Domain and range. Do they also swap? Well, the answer is yes. We said the domain focuses on the x values and the range focuses on the y values. So, let's say a function had the domain as x is an element of real numbers and it had the range as y is more than 3. We know this is the range of an exponential function. So, if this is an exponential function, then let's find the domain and the range of the inverse. You see, they're going to switch. The domain will become the range. So the domain will now become the range. So this means that the domain will now become the range. And where we had x, we're going to have y. Then y is an element of real numbers. And the range will now become the domain. Where we had the range, we're going to have the domain. And we're going to say that where we had x, where we had y, we're going to say that x is more than 3. So that's something important. You must know that because we said that for the inverse, we swap the x and the y values, even the domain and the range also swap. So let's have an example. Suppose you are given a straight line function, which is like this. We know that the domain of a straight line function is given as x is an element of real numbers, and the range is also given as y is an element of real numbers always. This means that for the inverse of a straight line function, we're going to say that the domain will now become the range, and where we had x, we're going to have y. Then y is an element of real numbers, and where we had the range, we'll now have the domain. And because we said that the range was y is an element of real numbers, where we had y, we're going to put x, and then x is an element of real numbers. Suppose we have a parabola. A parabola, let's see, is in this form, and here we have the point 1 and 3. We know the domain of a parabola, we said it's always x is an element of real numbers, and the range will depend on the possible y values that the graph has. The values of y, they start at 3 going up. So we're going to say that y is greater or equal to 3. The values of y are more than 3 and they're also equal to 3. So now let's talk about the domain and the range of the inverse. The domain will now become the range. And where we had x, we're going to put y. And y is an element of real numbers. And the range, we now have the domain. And where we had y, we now have x. And we can see that x is greater or equal to 3. So it's something very important. We must know that because we said for the inverse, we swap the x and the y values. Even the domain and the range, they also swap. I never showed you how we can draw a graph of the inverse. So suppose we are given the point, the graph, which is like this. Let's say here we have the point 2 and 0. Here we have the point 4 and 0. Okay, and then here we have the point 3. It's just a rough thing, 3 and -2. So we're going to draw the graph for the inverse. So because we said that, let's start with this point. Let's say this is point A, this is point B, and this is point C. So point A, the coordinates were 2 and 0. They'll now become 0 and 2, and the point will be here. You see? So this will now be 0 and 2, and this is A. And then C was 4 and 0 and will now become 4 and 0, and this will be a bit up. Apparently I don't have enough space, but it will be there. And we're going to have 0 and 4. And because the coordinates of B were given as 3 and -2, they'll now become -2 and 3. And the point will be here. It's -2 and then 3. So we have the point B here, which is -2 and 3. And if we draw our graph is going to look like this. You see, so this is how the graph is going to look like. So when we are calculating the inverse, we switch the x as well as the y values. Thank you for watching.